Montana Territory, late September 1885. The sun was going down behind the Bridger Range in that 10-minute gold that never lasts. And Wyatt Calloway was leaning on the porch rail with his bag already packed and sitting by the door, trying to say a goodbye that wasn't coming out right. "Your ranch is too big," he said. "Too big for two hands and a foreman pushing 60. Too big for you to run alone come winter, and I've got no business pretending 6 weeks of work makes me the answer to that." Clara Bennett was leaning on the same rail, close enough that the lantern behind them threw both their shadows into one shape on the boards. Her blonde hair had come half loose from its pins the way it always did by evening, and she looked at him a long moment, at the trail dust still in the creases of his shirt, at the bag by the door he hadn't managed to pick up yet. "Then stay," she said, "and take care of it." He opened his mouth to argue. "And me," she said before he could. Behind them, out past the corral, the last of the cattle drive dust from those same 6 weeks was still settling gold in the low light. He set the bag back down. "If you want to know how two people who'd both buried something got here, you have to go back 8 months, to the morning a woman half the county had written off learned she'd rather bury her own hands in the dirt than let anyone bury her future for her. 8 months before that porch, Clara Bennett had buried her husband and inherited 5,000 acres she had no earthly idea how to hold on to. Daniel Bennett had built the ranch from 160 acres of homestead claim into one of the largest spreads in the county, and he had died the way too many ranchers died that decade, caught beneath a spooked herd during a lightning storm on the spring drive, gone before anyone could reach him. Montana's property laws, unusually generous for a territory that far from Washington, meant the land passed to Clara outright, in her own name. No male relative required to hold the title for her. That was the law. It did not come with instructions for running a cattle operation twice the size of most outfits in the county, with a foreman nearing 60 and two hands who had been with Daniel since before Clara ever arrived. She was 28, and she grieved for exactly as long as the ranch would allow, which turned out to be no time at all. There were 3 days she never left the house, and her foreman, Hollis, covered for her without being asked. On the 4th morning she rose, pulled on Daniel's old work coat because it held more warmth than her own, and walked out to check the fence line herself, because somebody had to, and there was nobody left to volunteer. By August, the summer grass was already thinning early. The second dry summer running, the kind old-timers were starting to grumble about down at the stockyards. Roundup was coming, whether she felt ready or not, and feelings, she'd learned quickly, didn't much interest cattle. She pinned a notice at the stockyards in Bozeman. Hands wanted, Bennett Ranch, fair wage roundup season. She left out the word widow. She'd already discovered that word did one of two things to men. It made them pity her, or it made them think they could charge her double for the privilege of feeling sorry for her, and she had patience left for neither. 4 men answered that notice. 3 didn't last 2 weeks, unwilling to take orders from a woman who signed their pay. One left a note pinned to the bunkhouse door saying flatly he hadn't signed on to work for a woman, as if the labor itself had transformed the instant he learned whose name was on the ledger. Clara read it once, fed it to the stove, and rode out to check fence that same morning without telling a soul. The 4th man was still there come September, and he was the reason that porch conversation had gone the way it had. Wyatt Calloway rode in on a gray gelding with a bedroll, a rifle, and almost nothing else worth mentioning. Sandy hair pushed back under a hat that had seen better decades, 32 by his own account, and wearing every one of those years somewhere behind his eyes, even if his face hadn't caught up yet. He gave Hollis 4 sentences before the old foreman walked him over to Clara. "Says he's worked cattle from Texas to here," Hollis muttered, clearly unconvinced. "Won't say much past that." "You have references?" Clara asked. "No, ma'am," Wyatt said. "Just hands that know the work." It wasn't the kind of answer that usually kept a man employed, but there was something unshowy in the way he said it. A man who'd decided long ago that his past was nobody's business and his present was whatever task stood in front of him. Clara recognized it, because she'd been living a version of that same silence herself since spring. "Show me," she said, nodding toward the corral, where a green colt had been fighting 3 of her own hands for the better part of a week. He didn't ask what she wanted proven. He walked into that corral slow, let the colt circle him twice without so much as reaching for the halter. and had the animal standing calm at his shoulder inside 20 minutes, without raising his voice once. Clara watched the whole thing from the fence rail, arms folded, cataloging things she hadn't meant to catalog, the steadiness in his hands, the low, patient way he talked to a frightened animal, the fact that he never once glanced over to see if she was impressed. "You're hired," she said. Hollis kept muttering about strangers and references for another 2 weeks. Right up until the morning, Wyatt pulled a calf out of a bog on the North Range using a rope, a saddle horn, and no help at all, in under 4 minutes, while the rest of the crew was still riding toward the noise. After that, Hollis stopped muttering out loud, though he kept watching the new hand with the narrowed eyes of a man still reserving final judgment. And Clara found herself watching the new hand work a little longer than the job strictly required, for reasons that had nothing to do with judgment whatsoever. Silas Grady rode over from the Circle G that same week, unannounced, and didn't bother dismounting. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Bennett," he said. "Running a spread this size alone is going to bury you before the next bad winter does. I'll give you a fair price, fairer than you'll get anywhere else in this county, and you can be settled in Bozeman with money in the bank before the snow flies." "The ranch isn't for sale," Clara said. "Everything's for sale eventually," Grady said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man who'd simply watched that proven true often enough to stop questioning it. "I've bought out 6 outfits smaller than this one in the last 4 years. Every one of them thought they'd hold on. I give people time to come around to sense." "Is that a threat, Mr. Grady?" "It's patience," he said. "Though since we're being direct, Willow Creek crosses your North Range before it ever reaches the Circle G's main water. And I've spent 2 years buying up the filings upstream of you. A man in my position doesn't need to threaten anybody. He just needs a dry summer." He tipped his hat. "This one's shaping up to be one." He rode off before she could answer, and Clara stood in her own yard, cold and perfectly clear-headed, understanding that the real fight for her ranch had only just quietly opened, and that Daniel, for all his years, and his father's years before him, watering cattle at Willow Creek, had never once filed a formal claim on it with the Territorial Land Office. He'd simply always used it, the way half the county did, on the old understanding that use was its own form of right. Silas Grady did not share that understanding, and Clara didn't yet know why. She rode into Bozeman that week to ask around and learned only that Grady had shown up in the county some 20 years back, with almost nothing to his name, and had never once in 2 decades of buying land been the man who sold. The roundup that September turned out to be the hardest Clara had run since Daniel died, and it was Wyatt who carried them through it. There was a moment on the second day, a rock slide loosed by careless riding above the herd, cattle scattering into a ravine, 200 head suddenly surging toward the Willow Creek crossing where the bank dropped 6 feet into fast water. Clara was closest, her horse already wheeling to cut them off, when Wyatt came up hard on her flank and took the more dangerous line himself, driving 20 head back from the drop with nothing but his voice and a coiled rope while she held the rest. For a few seconds, she genuinely believed she was about to watch him go over that bank with them, and the fear that thought put in her chest told her more about where things stood between them than any conversation had managed to. Neither of them spoke of it that night. There was fence to mend and a fire to keep and 40 head still unaccounted for in the dark. But hauling wire beside him at midnight, Clara was aware of him in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be aware of anyone in 8 months, and unsettled enough by it that she worked twice as hard as necessary, just to keep her hands too busy to let her mind wander where it wanted to go. This story's traveled further than I ever expected when I first sat down with it. Readers writing in from Brazil, from Nigeria, from India, from the Philippines, places I'm only just starting to learn the shape of. If Clara and Wyatt are good company tonight, a like helps more than you'd guess. "Tell me where you're tuning in from." I read every comment. Now, Silas Grady's patience was about to run out, and Clara was about to discover exactly how far upstream that patience had already been quietly building against her. She found the trouble on a Tuesday morning. Willow Creek running at a third of its usual width through the north pasture, cattle already crowding the shrunken waterline. Wyatt rode the creek up to the property line with her, and that's where they found it. A crude headgate cut into the creek bed, just above the Bennett boundary, bleeding the main flow east onto Circle G land. "That's not legal," Wyatt said, crouched at the bank, running a hand along the freshly cut timber. Before I was a hand, I did survey work for a land office in Colorado Territory out here runs on prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. Whoever put a claim on this water first and used it continuously owns it, filed paperwork or not, provided you can prove the use. He built that in daylight, Clara said. He's not even hiding it. Man that confident usually keeps building, Wyatt said. I'd wager there's more work planned up here tonight, not just what we're standing over. They rode back after dark to be sure, saying little to each other along the way, both of them understanding, without needing to say it, that whatever they found tonight would decide how the rest of this played out. They didn't wait long. 2 riders came up the creek a little past midnight with fresh timber lashed to a pack mule, working fast and quiet at the headgate by lantern light, widening the diversion. By the look of the second frame, they'd already gotten started. Wyatt didn't draw on them. He rode in close enough that his rifle sat visible across his saddle without ever leaving it, and said evenly, "You're on Bennett land." The younger of the 2 men reached for something at his belt before the other stopped him with a hand on his arm. For one long second, nobody moved, and the only sound in the whole valley was the creek running low between them. Clara's own heart was so loud in her ears, she barely caught Wyatt speaking again. Lower now, aimed straight at the younger rider. "Whatever he's paying you," Wyatt said, "isn't worth what happens if that hand finishes moving." The hand stopped moving. Then Silas Grady himself rode up out of the dark, unhurried, like a man arriving at his own supper table. "Stand down," he told his men. And they did. He looked at Wyatt's rifle, still resting, still not raised, and something in his face registered the restraint, even as his voice stayed flat. "I told you this was patience, Mrs. Bennett. Patience doesn't mean I sit idle while I wait. Building on land that isn't yours isn't patience," Clara said. "It's theft with better manners." Grady was quiet a moment, looking at the water instead of either of them. "I foremaned for a man named Cyrus Whitlock 20 years back," he said finally. "Good man, slow man. I watched 3 partners talk him out of everything he owned, one reasonable-sounding argument at a time, while he stood there being fair about it. I buried him broke. I decided a long time ago I'd rather be the one doing the talking than the one being talked out of his life. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth of it." He turned his horse. "Take the timber down before the land office hears about it. I'll find another way." They didn't believe him for a second. 2 nights later, riding the creek line to confirm the timber had actually come down, the conversation between Clara and Wyatt finally stopped being only about water. "You went in that night without ever pointing that rifle?" Clara said, wanted to ask why. "Man raises a gun. Everyone in earshot starts making worse decisions," Wyatt said. "Rather they see it and remember it's there." "You've done that before." "Had my own claim once," he said. "North of Denver. Drought took it in '83. Same as it's threatening to take half this county now. I watched 2 dry years turn 8 years of work into nothing. Didn't have it in me to start over building something that could be taken the same way twice." He looked at the water, low and quiet between its banks. "Easier to work another man's land? Nothing to lose when the sky doesn't cooperate?" "That's not living," Clara said. "That's just not losing." "Seemed like the same thing for a while," he said. "Now I'm not so sure." She thought about Daniel then, not with guilt, but with something closer to permission. Daniel had built this place because he couldn't imagine losing what he loved. Wyatt had built nothing for 2 years because he couldn't imagine loving something enough to risk losing it again. She found herself wondering which kind of man was actually harder to lose, the one who built everything and left too soon, or the one who'd stopped building anything at all, so there'd be nothing left to grieve. Neither of them said another word that evening, but the next morning she noticed he'd fixed a sagging gate. Nobody had asked him to fix. The kind of small, thankless repair a man only bothers with once he's stopped counting the days until he leaves. Grady moved faster than his promise suggested. He filed a formal claim on the Willow Creek water rights at the Territorial Land Office in Bozeman that same week, backdated to his purchase of the upstream parcels 2 years prior. A legal maneuver built on the simple fact that nobody had ever bothered filing against him. Montana wouldn't be a state for another 4 years yet. Until then, the Territorial Land Office was, for all practical purposes, the only authority deciding who owned what, and Grady understood that better than anyone in the county. If the claim stood unchallenged past the 30-day notice period, the water belonged to the Circle G outright, and Clara's herd would be drinking dust by the next summer. Hollis read the notice out loud at the kitchen table, slow the way a man reads bad news, when he's hoping careful delivery will somehow make it less true. "We need sworn statements from every neighbor who remembers this creek running to Bennett land before Grady ever touched it," Wyatt said. "And we need to be standing in that land office with them before the notice closes." "That's half the county to ride to," Clara said. "Then we start riding," Wyatt said, already reaching for his hat. There was no more talk of the porch, or of whatever had quietly started between them. Both of them understood that the fight for the water was, underneath it, a fight for everything else too. A Clara Bennett who lost the ranch would be a Clara Bennett, with no reason left to ask anyone to stay. They spent 11 days riding to every homestead within 30 miles that had ever watered stock off Willow Creek in the last 2 decades. Old Ezra Toms, who'd ranched beside Daniel's father, remembered the creek by name from before Clara was even born, and signed his statement with a hand that shook from age, not doubt. "Your father-in-law used to say that water didn't belong to anybody," he told her, pouring coffee on his porch while Wyatt wrote his account down word for word. "Said it belonged to whoever needed it enough to keep showing up for it, year after year. Guess that's you now." The elders of 2 Crow families camped along the North Fork remembered the water running free through that valley longer than any Bennett or Grady had ever held paper on it at all. Testimony the territorial court would weigh less than it deserved, though Wyatt made certain it went into the record regardless, and said so plainly when the land office clerk tried to wave it aside. A dozen smaller ranchers Grady had already leaned on added their names too, some of them grinning while they signed, glad of the chance to finally stand against him for once. By the 11th day, riding back into Bozeman in the gray hour before the land office opened, Clara had a stack of statements thick enough to fill a saddlebag, and a tired, grateful understanding that none of it would exist without the quiet man riding beside her, who had spent 11 days doing a job nobody was paying him for. The hearing itself took less than an hour. Grady's lawyer argued the filing date and the paperwork. Wyatt laid out 20 years of continuous documented use against paper filed, late to claim something that had never belonged to the claimant in the first place. The land agent, visibly weary of this exact argument playing out across his desk year after year, ruled the way the doctrine was built to rule, proven use over recent paper every time. Grady left without a word, which told Clara more than any speech could have. Outside on the courthouse steps, Wyatt stood turning his hat over in his hands. "Water's yours," he said. "Season's near over. Reckon my work here is done." "Reckon it is," Clara said, watching him carefully. "Should probably get moving before winter," he said, and didn't move at all. That was the conversation that finally finished 6 days later on the porch at sundown. The bag by the door, the cattle dust still settling gold, and 2 sentences that said what 11 days on the trail hadn't quite managed to. They married in Bozeman before the first snow, with Ezra Toms standing witness and half the small ranchers who'd signed those water statements turning out for the wedding supper after. The way a county does when it's just watched one of its own hold onto something worth holding onto. Hollis retired that winter to a cabin on the property, on the condition his own insisted upon that he still got final say on anything involving cattle. Wyatt filed the Willow Creek rights properly that spring, in both their names, so no headgate built by anyone ever again would find easy ground to stand on. Grady never rode over again, not for supper, not for another offer. But the following spring, a letter arrived at the ranch in his handwriting. 3 lines. No apology in it, exactly. Just an acknowledgement that he'd been wrong about how the fight would end, and a wish that the water treated them kinder than it had treated him. Clara read it twice and put it away in the same drawer where she kept Daniel's letters. Not because it belonged there, but because she didn't yet know where else a thing like that was supposed to go. The ranch was still too big for 2 hands and a foreman. It was not too big for 2 people who'd decided to hold it together on purpose. By the following September, watching the roundup dust rise gold over land that had nearly slipped away from her twice in 1 year, Clara finally understood why he'd been right on that porch, in the one thing he'd said that actually mattered. It had always been too big to run alone. I keep coming back to that headgate, and to the 2 very different men who stood on either side of it. Grady wasn't wrong about much. He'd watched a good man get talked out of everything he owned, and he decided he'd rather be the one holding the paper than the one losing it. You can understand that and still believe he built the wrong thing in the dark to make sure of it. Wyatt had lost land too, and it broke him in a completely different direction toward never wanting anything badly enough to risk losing it twice. It took a woman who wasn't asking him to risk a claim, just to risk staying, before that changed. Same wound pointed two different ways. One man built a headgate, the other man fixed a gate nobody asked him to fix. I think that's most of what actually tells you who somebody is. Not what happened to them, but what they quietly start building afterward. Thanks for riding along with me today. Until next time, keep writing.